Welcome to Blockchain Recorded, the podcast for the tech curious, where we talk about anything and everything related to the exponentially evolving crypto, blockchain, and Web 3.0 space. Our mission is simple: to share knowledge, facilitate discourse, and help evolve education in blockchain fundamentals, decentralization solutions, and relevant use cases for today's digital economy. We at Blockchain Recorded are not registered investment advisors and do not deal with financial or trading token elements, nor offer any licensed financial services. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, while the opinions of all parties involved are their own. I'm your host, Nina Tserar, and now let's talk blockchain. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd like to remind everyone to follow us on X, Recorded Podcast, where we pre-stream each episode on Spaces the day before distribution to all major podcast platforms. For the full platform list, visit our website, blockchainrecorded.com. And with us today, we have Michael Rosmer, the co-founder of De.Fi, which is the first crypto antivirus and super app solution for all things DeFi. He brings over 20 years of experience in the financial services industry, where he previously helped clients with international business and banking at offshore capitalist and crown financial strategists. His foray into DeFi was catalyzed by this work, as the role led him to use crypto for international transactions. Michael, welcome to Blockchain Recorded.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure is all mine. Michael, 20 plus years in financial services, so TradFi, as we call it today. I had the opportunity to listen to several of your talks, ranging from your offshore citizen content, the DeFi yield, also some of your general outlooks on Web3 and DeFi and what it all means in today's world. Tell us, who is Michael Rosmer today?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question.
Because in 5 years, it's an evolution.
Yeah. So when we started arranging all sorts of different interviews and things for media and going out there, we had to come up with a bio. And I typically hate putting together bios, first of all, because I don't really like talking about myself. And second of all, because of the fact that I think most bios are boring or sound like some sort of PR nonsense. And so I'm like, all right, well, what do you do? How do you describe yourself? You know, you could give some like adjective soup, which is sort of meaningless.
Yeah.
And so hence, like, what do you do? And so I happened to be reading a book, which is kind of relevant to Web3, I guess, called the Starfish and the Spider. And it's all about decentralized organizations. Nothing really like sort of pre-Web3, you know, talks about lots of different interesting stuff that's developed in the world, like Alcoholics Anonymous, etc. And they were going through and they were describing sort of different roles that are important in that context. And one of these happened to be the idea of a catalyst. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of things that I might like to think of myself as, but I'd be like, I don't know if I can authentically claim that I live up to that. But I like to try and think of myself as a bit of a catalyst. And so anything from how I use my money to how I use my time to influence relationships, etc. I think the idea for me is to be able to be in a position where I can see something that I think is important in the world and I can initiate. I tend to be a very good initiator. A lot of people are not. I was kind of surprised to discover that because it comes so easily to me. And I figure, okay, I can initiate and I can kind of like give things a kickstart and catalyze the formation of something else. And so, you know, I won't necessarily do everything involved in it. I won't necessarily, I'm a terrible manager. I'm, you know, not the best salesperson. I'm not all these different things. But I think that I endeavor, at least, to be somebody who tries to catalyze things that I think are important in the world. That's how I would principally describe myself. And then, you know, that shows up in many, many different ways through, you know, the work that I do with helping people to become more international in their lives, the work that I do in Web3, the investing that I do, et cetera, et cetera.
So offshore citizen is one. You just mentioned the international aspect. Then why the jump to Web3 and why crypto? And then, well, actually, eventually, then why DeFi?
Well, so the way that I typically describe it to people is I say that I hate banks and I like technology. And so that just automatically leads to Web3.
That tells a lot.
But in kind of like more specifically, I think that, so I like technology. I think that really the improvements in life, like you can compare, you can say, okay, well, the average person today lives better than the richest person in the world 100 years ago, at least in Western societies. Okay, in some parts of Africa, no, but, and why is that? I don't actually think it's because, well, governments are so good and, that's been so great. I think it's basically because of technology. Our lives are made better principally over time because of technology. And so we want to focus in some sort of area that you can build something that is enduring, it has ability to scale and reach. It's not like a repetitive, like I hate maintenance. I'm not a maintenance person. I'm very bad at it, etc. So, if it comes to cleaning every day, I hate the repetitiveness of this task. I like the fact that you can do something, you solve a problem once, and the problem is solved, and now off you go. And technology, to me, kind of does that, which I think is really important to moving us forward. You sort of think you could swim across the river every day, or you could go and you could build a bridge and not have to swim across maybe ever again. And so I think that is just really, really important if you care about moving the world forward. And I sort of hold this morality view that we should have this basic premise of being the best version of ourselves we can be and leaving the world a better place than we found it. And so this should sort of be at the heart of how we think about things. And technology just strikes me as being incredibly important in that area. And then, unfortunately, one of the areas that I think is probably least just is the financial system. If you just kind of take a look at the inequalities that exist for people depending on the country that they're in. I mean, some people can't open bank accounts because of that. Literally somebody will be born in a country. They might have nothing to do that with that country, but they're restricted because of that. And I think that's a grave injustice. And I think that injustice has like very far-reaching effects that are really, really hard to quantify. There's maybe the best book ever written is a book called Wind, Sand, and Stars by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And in that book, in the last chapter, he tells this story about walking. He was on a train, and he was in the first class car, and he walked back into the third class, and there was these Polish refugees who were there. This was in the 1930s or something like that, 1940s, probably 1930s. And he said he looked down, and he see these people all clumped together. It's super packed. And he's like, the poverty doesn't bother me. He's like, people can learn to be happy in all sorts of circumstances. What bothers me is seeing in this little boy a bit of Mozart murdered. And I think there's like a lot of truth to that there are all kinds of people who are not enabled because of these really despicable, arbitrary injustices. We have like this world where we sit and we talk about things like, there's racism, blah, blah, blah. This is a big thing. Well, what's like the bigger thing is where you're born. Where you're born happens to be like this gross inequality. And I remember I was living in Serbia for a little while. My wife is from Montenegro.
Oh, really?
And yeah.
Former Yugoslavia. Well, I'm Slovenian, so we consider.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, I remember I was hiring people in Serbia, and there's wonderful people in Serbia, lots of hardworking, ethical, educated, etc. people, but. The Serbian government is like terrible to their people. And one of the ways is they have financial restrictions. So it was like for a very long time, you couldn't get PayPal there. And so it just made it difficult for people who were very capable of doing something to get paid. And if they couldn't get paid, they basically couldn't work, which didn't give them access to a global economy and so on and so forth. And like, how stupid, what a ridiculous waste of human potential. And if you care about innovation, then you want more innovators. And, there's all this stuff going on here. And so, I just find that it's a gravely unjust system. I don't have any trust whatsoever for any of the people at the top. I think that's pretty much grossly dysfunctional, grossly corrupt. Corrupt in, not to say that every party involved in it is corrupt, but the system as a whole is quite rotten. It's highly unequal in how it enforces. There's no accountability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's just like a really, really bad system. And so that leads to Web3. And Web3, I think, kind of starts with, you have Bitcoin, you have decentralization of money and stuff like that. Okay, that's an interesting idea. But then you want to actually do things. And I remember early on in my Web3 journey, I was not even storing money on exchanges, but I would get paid from people in crypto, and I would transfer it from my private wallet to the exchange out into fiat. There'd be a one-day window that it was there. And on 2 occasions, for exchanges rug pulled,
This is the Quadriga story.
Quadriga.
One of them.
Yeah, that's one of them, exactly. Yeah, and you just think about this and you're like exchanges are so antithetical to the whole concept of Web3, right? You're supposed to have this kind of trustless, code is law. Okay, really code is not law, community is law, but anyway, sort of thing. And so when I discovered Uniswap, I was like, man, this is the greatest thing ever. You don't have to give up control of your stuff in order to be able to go and access these services. And how useful is that in dozens of different areas? Like, the world is very behind. And then as I got into it more, what I began to notice was that you're in a situation where the pace of innovation in an open system is radically higher. I mean, you can go log into your Bank of America or one of these big banks apps. It's garbage. It's complete trash. The user interface was like something designed in the 90s. I don't know what people are talking about here. And you're like, why is it so bad? And it's like, well, there's this calcification. It's difficult to get anything done. You've got this legacy architecture that you're building on. And in Web3, somebody launches a project, and next week there's a copycat, and 2 weeks later there's 5 copycats of that copycat that are all doing their own little iteration. Like, the pace of innovation in that kind of open system is just radically higher. And then you add composability and all this. So I think that it's a great... the potential of that space, and yes, there's tons and tons of problems with this space. It's very early on, et cetera. But I think that if you care about moving things forward and you care about technology, et cetera, this is probably the most rapid possibility for iterating to something better.
Absolutely. Just a few steps back, when did you come to the realization that sort of our government systems and, okay, that's another topic, but traditional finance and what comes along with it is corrupt and just crap, and sort of, when did you get disillusions with it? When did you realize? Did you have like an aha moment? Was this an iterative process? Was it COVID that gave you that stamp of approval? When did you realize what was going on?
I think it was a progressive realization. I think, I was probably, in some respects, lucky and somewhat unlucky to, I had a great uncle who was like deep into the like anti-bank, anti-fractional reserve banking type thing. And so, I don't know.
So you've had the discourse of that. You heard of that before. Yeah,
exactly. Like, I would certainly say that it took quite a while for me to realize just how corrupt a lot of things are in the system. I grew up as an entrepreneur. I had my first business when I was in high school, and I was surrounded by people who were kind of like me. And so somebody would criticize rich people or something. I'm like, what are you talking about? We work hard, we take risks, we whatever. And I wasn't exposed at that time to like a lot of the bullshit that happens on Wall Street, right? And the truth is, when you start getting into this, actually, there's a lot of people who are not getting rich because of the fact that they're working hard and taking good entrepreneurial risks and things. They just understand how to exploit the system. And, there's a lot of, kind of socialized losses of some of this stuff. And so a lot of that has been very progressive over time. I think the thing that was most poignant to me was when I started to deal with international banking and seeing restrictions on financial transactions and seeing people having their accounts closed down and seeing how some people just couldn't, I don't think that I had nearly as much perspective on it until I started to deal internationally and deal with people in other countries and live in other countries and stuff like that. And then you're like, holy shit, what's going on here? I often quote Gavin Wood in his statement that, back in the day, if I wanted to give you $5, what do? I reach across, I give you $5. Nowadays, you have to trust a bank. You have to be like, hey, listen, can you please let me have permission to send this person money?
Yeah,
it's like, you shouldn't have to do that.
I have to ask for permission.
I just don't think that should be the case. And I especially think that, it used to be, people will say, you don't have to worry about the bank because you have cash. Well, when we lived in a little microcosm where we did business with the people who were in the physical space around us, you had this permissionless form of transaction, which was, I hand you cash, right? But in a global interconnected world where people are relying on work from around the world, and I was mentioning kind of the injustice of, look, like if you're in Kenya or Nigeria or something like that, the best economic opportunities for you are probably working for some sort of a foreign company. If you can't send and receive money through the electronic payment rails, you're basically denying that person the right to exist. And I think that's just terrible.
Yeah. And going back to what you said, it really does matter what cards you're dealt in life. Exactly what you said in terms of, you're born with the geographical, the environment that you're in, the opportunities that you can have.
Yeah.
So it does matter. And there's obviously a spectrum. Interesting that you mentioned, you talk about Serbia and Montenegro. It's more dear to my heart because even though I'm from Slovenia, we still we still consider the neighboring republics as like our former brothers,
Sure, yeah, we're part of former Yugoslavia.
I'm sure your wife has talked about that. And Slovenia was always considered like the Switzerland of, former Yugoslavia. And, going back to, to why people are the way they are there. It's funny because even the Slovenians were frustrated with how even though they're very warm and compassionate people, the Serbians are very temperamental. But in terms of the systems were broken, but also because they just didn't trust the government.
Why should they?
For certain reasons. These are always war-torn, regions.
Yep.
So I find it that there's an aspect of, there's also what the culture and the society has experienced that's ingrained in them. Then you have the Scandinavians that usually never were really involved in war, and they live differently, and they live more pragmatically, and they, they don't save as much versus like the people in this, Eastern European Balkan region. Yep. But a little bit of a side note, I echo to what you mentioned, what you said. So with all that in mind. And we'll get to this later on, but just what exactly was, there was the rug pull of Quadriga, you can talk about that. What ignited you to then co-found De.Fi? And also within that, you're also delving into the security space within the Web3.
Yeah, so, I think that the interest in the stuff that I was just mentioning catalyzed an interest in myself and our co-founders in sort of playing in that space and investing in that space and, that sort of thing. And then once you start getting in there, you start to realize that there are a whole bunch of problems because it's a very nascent space, right? You just don't have a lot of stuff that you would hope to have. So let's just start with, you can't really easily figure out what your profit and loss is. This is like remarkably difficult to figure out when you're doing some yield farming or staking or whatever, and the prices of everything is changing relative to something else, and it's not clear when something is paid out or when it's not, and all this sort of thing. So essentially we were investors, and as we started to do this, we're like, okay, well, if I'm going to put hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line, then I'm doing that into something called cake or sushi, and what the heck is this thing? Yeah, exactly, right? I remember going to my wife one day, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm staking my cake on beefy with it's just like, what is this nonsense you're saying here?
Are you having breakfast? Brunch? What is
Exactly, right? And so it doesn't exactly endeavor a ton of trust. Let's be clear. And it's pretty opaque. There's this idea of like transparency in Web3 and open source and all this. But the reality, of course, is that for normal people, they can't read smart contracts, right? They have no idea what this says.
What it even is.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, creates that information asymmetry tends to create a lot of predatory behavior. And so we started hiring, fortunately, we kind of had resources from previous businesses and things like this. And so we started hiring some people who could do audits for us. And we created the first community-driven audits. So we weren't, there's audit firms that you can hire, but we were just doing it for ourselves and then open sourcing it because you might as well if you're going to do it anyway. And then we were the first ones to take the community, basically saying, "Oh, we want you to audit this project," and we would do it. And so we started going through that process, and we discovered that there was a few different things going on. One was just totally unscalable, right? Like how many smart contracts get launched per day, and every smart contract audit takes quite a while. It costs a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, you're sitting here recording what you're earning and where your tokens are and all this sort of thing on a Google sheet or some nonsense like this manually, which is just a totally insane idea. And so we figured, well, we need to build some tools for ourselves. And if you're going to build tools for yourself, you might as well build tools for other people. And we had a fairly major issue where one of the protocols that we were involved in rug pulled, and that was like a pretty major loss. I think it was across the protocol or something like $15 million. And
oh wow!
Between my partners and I, there was like over $1 million loss. So
was this early on? Sorry to interrupt, but was this early on?
Yeah, this was like kind of like late De.Fi summer sort of time frame.
2020-ish?
2020, yeah. It was like, I don't know, fall of 2020, late 2020, something like that. Yeah. So it's like those types of moments where like, all right, we need to not have this happen in the future. And obviously you don't want it to happen to other people either. It's just like generally bad for the space if people are losing money in that regard.
Right.
And so we figured, well, let's create tools to prevent that. And that kind of led to building basically taking our expertise in auditing through our team there and automating those processes so they could be infinitely scalable. And you could run on any smart contract in seconds and not have to worry about waiting for $20,000 to $120,000 audit to come back a week or two later. And you could track all your things and try and make it more accessible and safer for the general public to be able to participate. And yeah, that was kind of like the start of it.
We'll definitely get into De.Fi and your suite of solutions or tooling solutions in there. But just taking a step back to the security aspect of Web3, how do you see its evolution I guess, compared to, I don't know, 5 years ago? I guess that's probably around the time that maybe you started, that you co-founded De.Fi, or if I'm not mistaken, was it 2020? And we're in 2024. So
2020, yeah.
Yeah, I guess what's the evolution that you've seen, or is there an evolution? I mean, I imagine with all the many scams and rug pulls and thefts in crypto that we've seen and what you've experienced, that we would hope that we've learned from them. How do you see that, how it's evolved from where you started?
So, I mean, when we got started, a lot of these things were just very new, right? So if you sort of think Aave was created in like the fall of 2019, I think. And so, during that period of time when we were getting started, a lot of these primitives were just being created for the first time, right? Yeah. I mean, you had Urine Finance during that summer, kind of going crazy, et cetera. You had, this vampire attack from SushiSwap, Uniswap. And so like a lot of that stuff was just sort of getting started. And people were building things for the first time. So I think one of the benefits we have today is a lot of that stuff has been built out now. We have like a basic infrastructure. And you'll notice that as you move from one chain to another, frequently you're talking about basically just a fork of, Uniswap v2, Uniswap v3, et cetera, et cetera. And so that allows you to have a bit more battle-tested infrastructure in place, which is good. And people kind of learn a lot of the common vulnerabilities. And so that's all pretty helpful. I think that the normal the types of attack vectors that you had back then have evolved somewhat because the broad community is a bit more aware of a lot of the things that are going on. Also, I mean, a lot of the things that were happening, and I mean, still do happen, are not sort of like malicious. They are just inadvertent because, somebody fails to check something to do with the state of something while they're doing a call on a contract, or there's some sort of a memory issue or whatever. So there's a lot of just like best practices that can be built into these things today, and the tooling for developers to be able to write a bit more robust smart contracts, I think, has improved a fair bit. So in that regard, I would say we've made some progress. You certainly see that. Then there's new attack vectors that have come up, like, over the last while, the largest hacks have typically been bridge attacks, right? And so that's been a huge issue. So bridges were kind of like a new area of focus. And so, I don't know, you could kind of describe it as the target changed a little bit over time, and you discovered that there's new vulnerabilities and new dependencies, et cetera. So I think that my perspective on it broadly today is the base level is better, and we've kind of plugged up a bunch of the sort of really primitive things, which is good. And there are definitely much better tools out there to help protect yourself, like our tools, for example. But I think that at the same time, there is still a pretty major lack of awareness. I mean, if you just kind of think, okay, well, anyone can deploy a smart contract, and so it's easy to deploy honeypots and scams and all this other sort of thing. And if you were to say, like, use tools like ours, then they just detect that for you, and it's not a problem. But how many people, as a percentage of the overall user base, are using tools like ours when they do that? Oh, it's relatively small, right? And so I think there's still lots of education to do, and I think there's a lot of kind of automation to be implemented to bring these to bear. I often liken this whole thing, the analog that I use a lot, is what happened with antiviruses and anti-malware on computers in sort of the late 90s, early 2000s period, you might recall just how all these people were moving away from Mac or from PC and onto Mac in part because
of the malware.
You had all this malware.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And today, like, the truth is, if you go and get a PC with Windows 11 on it, there's no malware. It's just kind of gone away. And the reason is we've just done the software better, and we've got all sorts of antiviruses, et cetera, that just kind of kill it. And I think one of the things that happens there is you kill the incentive. If it's really hard to succeed or you can't get much from the success, then the payoff isn't as great to work on it. And so I think that's a positive move, but I think we're still not nearly far enough in that process. We have quite a bit of distance left to go. So, I don't know, like we're probably like, if I was to use that analogy again, kind of going back, late 90s, early 2000s, we're probably like 2001 or something in that journey. So we probably have another.
Oh, in terms of the .com boom as well.
We'll see on that regard with respect to prices. But in terms of like,
we're like in it.
Yeah, right now it feels great right now, and you can kind of go.
It's a little crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but yeah, I think there's the thing that's I think partially missing from that is the usability for people, right? It's just kind of the usability, accessibility, integration of everything. It's a very fractured space, kind of by design.
Right.
And that makes it difficult in order to pull together a seamless, easy experience. And so, we definitely have more work to do, lots more work to do. But it's, at least if people have the tools, I think that's a step forward. The one thing that it kind of concerns me a bit is the level of cybercrime in general, not really necessarily to do with some of this stuff, but like phishing attacks, right? I talked to somebody who they Googled Uniswap one day, and they hit the first link, which happened to be a misspelling of Uniswap that was a phishing scam and drained their wallet.
Right.
Like there's a huge amount of cybercrime out there these days, which is affecting banking. It's affecting all kinds of stuff. And so that's probably only going to increase as you get AI that, is able to do this in an automated fashion and make it quicker and easier. And, again, the payoff is pretty high. So I think we're still, I don't know, several years away from being at a place where I think that it's really pretty solid for the average person.
Do you think that AI can have a positive impact here in terms of the security?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, do you think about that, or do you worry about that? Or not, or none of the above?
I think it goes both ways, right? Like, I kind of think nuclear power is, great as a source of energy, and nuclear weapons are absolutely horrible for humanity, right? And so it's sort of a double-edged sword in that regard.
It's not a bad comparison.
I think, we have to sort of start by defining, like, what is AI, right?
Yeah.
Because you can use, I can feed a whole bunch of data into something, and I can do some big data analytics, and, I ran some sort of a regression algorithm or something. Like, is that AI? It has kind of an AI-like effect for many people. I suspect that some of the things that might become really interesting as being helpful for people is, the natural language interfaces where somebody can talk to a system and have it do what they want. In theory, you should be able to build those to do all the steps that you should be doing without you having to think about doing them. And that could be really useful. Certainly, AI can have the power to, simulate transactions, and, it can figure out ways to test code and find vulnerabilities. And so overall, I think there's, a huge chance for a net positive. But at the same time, you look at deep fakes and you think about how people can go and generate mass content that's fake and, this sort of thing. I mean, that's also got its own pernicious issues to it. So, I think in the next probably 5 years, it's probably a net good, but I think that it will create a lot of noise in the meantime. And I don't think that the next 5 years will address in any way what I call collective crisis of sense making. I think you'll probably just magnify it by a significant amount, and that will become probably pretty problematic. It'll be hard to figure out how to navigate that particular problem.
That, and also what is true and what is not.
Yeah, that's.
But that's a whole nother story. It's a whole nother rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And it's not really clear to me. There's like some people who will be like, the only way to solve this is through blockchain. I really haven't seen a compelling case for how blockchain solves that problem, to be honest with you. I think so.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess. Well, I came into this space with a skeptical outlook, but given everyone that I've talked to over the past 2.5 years, there are some compelling cases that blockchain can help, whether or not it's healthcare or supply chain or more mechanical topics like that. But otherwise, yeah, until you see the results, it's kind of hard to believe it. I have another question with respect to security. For most of us in the space, I guess for over five years now, or more than that, it's pretty understandable to hold assets in cold storage wallets, for example. Mm-hmm. I personally noticed that younger crypto users, so I guess more Gen Z and just younger, probably half of my age people, don't practice the same security measures and hold their assets, and they basically hold their assets in their wallet extensions. Mm-hmm. Do you see, or your team, or do you look at this stuff? Do you see any particular user trends, or do you pay any attention to that?
It's a good question. I tend to find that people are willing to favor convenience over safety pretty aggressively. Mm-hmm. Would I say that is grouped by demographic in some way? I don't think that I've noticed that. Mm-hmm. So what I've noticed is there's sort of what I would call the old guard of, it's like the cypherpunk spirit that Bitcoin and Ethereum, et cetera, evolved from. And those people sort of understand what I would call the crypto ethos, mm-hmm. of not your keys, not your coins, self-custody, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately, there's this perverse incentive, which is the proliferation and marketing of those ideas is driven mostly by number go up. And the people who come in for number go up, it's not really because they believe in this deep ethos. They haven't necessarily thought of it that much. And I find those people are much more willing to compromise. And so I find that during bull markets, you notice this a lot more, right? You see, it's kind of the FTX thing. Realistically, like I said, mm-hmm. exchanges are antithetical to Web3 ethos. So why are you holding a whole bunch of money on FTX? Well, the answer is because they had a product that was really easy to use. It was really accessible. They're paying for big advertising and bringing on all kinds of people. And mm-hmm. when you're in that situation, people who just want to make money quickly, they don't really care about jumping through all these hoops, going through all these hassles. The reality is that, going and using a Trezor or something is a bit of a pain, right? It's not necessarily the easiest process, whereas you can pull up your local exchange app, which is on your phone, just like any other app you're used to, and you can just click buy and it's done in seconds and execute these limit orders and take on a whole bunch of leverage, and the leverage seems great when everything is going up. And so, yeah, I think that what I notice is generally the old guard tends to be a lot more like that. I don't necessarily notice that it's age so much, because I notice older people who come in fresh today don't necessarily share the same cold storage, et cetera, sort of mindset. And
no, really?
Yeah, I don't really notice that. I don't notice that trend. Now, I don't have any stats to support it, so maybe
but I guess just
kind of anecdotally observing a bunch of users. Mm-hmm. So I find that kind of newer people have less of that ethos built in, and you're in a situation where the bull markets tend to accentuate risky behavior.
Oh, absolutely.
And bear markets tend to people kind of remember a little bit more of what it's all about. So, yeah, that's just kind of the observation that I have in this regard.
Yeah. In terms of the bull and the bears, in terms of that market, it's when it comes down to all of this, we're such, psychological beings that so many times, I just wonder,
yes,
what goes through the minds of people. We find ourselves in some situations as well. You get through this rush of, the FOMO and the greed. But it's interesting, and I always find, or ask myself, are we going to learn? Is this always going to be the same? Because going down through history, it's always been that way. History repeats itself in rhyme. Which this actually brings me to my next question. we're talking about DeFi, and at first glance, it seems complicated and risky and untrustworthy. But in reality, when you look at the big picture, it's much more inclusive than TradFi, which is what you talked about at the beginning. And in theory, with some knowledge or direction and actually an internet connection and hardware, it can have a part. Anyone can have a part in the crypto world through DeFi, right? But still, and I would argue then you have the broadband problem, which is still a shortcoming in some underdeveloped parts of the world, but that's a separate story. But still the scamminess lingers, right? And then you come to more, not just spot trades, but you come to yield farming.
For sure.
I see yield farming projects promising, anything that's up to like over 100, 1,000%. It's a direct too good to be true giveaway. But people still fall for these types of scams with these psychological hooks. Like I said, the FOMO, the greed, the need to earn fast, obviously FOMO, fear of missing out. What is, in your opinion, or, well, you probably deal with this all the time, what is the way to protect users in the scenario of yield farming, for example? Is this where De.Fi comes in?
So I think we always need to think about, there are different types of risks, right? So our software is designed to warn you about failures in coding, I would say. There's fundamental problems here in the code, so we can detect that. Or coding in such a way that appears to be malicious. So, for example, a person has the capability to do infinite minting, or stuff like that, right? They have migration function, which isn't inherently bad, but you have to kind of wonder, all right, well, if you can do infinite minting, why do you have that? It's hard to justify. And so our software, I think, if those are the types of risks that you're talking about, does a great job of addressing the vast majority of them. And we're trying to make it easier and easier to automate the process more and more so that people's experience can be kind of seamless. The other type, though, is, somebody launches a project that just has no substance to it. Somebody goes and offers really insane rewards because that's the incentive, is to offer insane rewards, And that's sort of can you protect somebody from themselves? You were mentioning the thing about psychology. I mean, very difficult to protect people from their own psychology. And I think it's the problem, we have rising obesity, right? Well, one of the reasons we have rising obesity is because companies have learned to play off hijacking the amygdala, giving you high sugar, high fat, which are candy for the brain. Historically, your body really craved that because it knew this is calorie dense, etc. And today we have no scarcity of calories, and as a result, it kind of works against us. So similar sort of idea here. I can come and I can show you, you're getting 1,000,000% APY. And what is the psychology of somebody? Somebody's like, you know what? Even if I lose the money, all I have to do is get this 1,000,000% APY for a few days, and it's paid for it all. So it's justified. The upside is so great that it justifies the downside. I actually have this theory. There's all this talk within the regulatory circles of are these securities, and we should regulate it as securities. And I actually think that principally they should regulate it as gambling for the most part, because you sort of think this is really more casino behavior than it is actually investing behavior in a lot of this stuff. I actually am generally against regulation fairly broadly in this space, but it would actually make more sense if the regulators were coming and saying, hey, we're going to start regulating these guys as casinos and cause them to get casino licenses as opposed to broker-dealer licenses or some sort of exchange license, et cetera. So yeah, I think that's a very tough problem. And I think this is actually, I have this kind of theory where you can ask the question, what are the biggest challenges in society today? And to me, the main problems that exist spawn from the fact that we're basically outdated machines. So what does that mean? So if you think about it, the way that evolution works is the environment changes and then we adapt to the environment. And this always means that the environmental changes are ahead of our kind of biological adaptive mechanisms. And in this particular case, as technology has come on, it's created an explosion of complexity and scale in our world. We've never had the extreme complexity that we do today. We've never had the extreme scale effects. I mean, during the last bull market, somebody bought $1,000 of Shiba token one summer, and by the next summer it was worth $8 billion or something.
Yeah, that's insane.
It's totally nuts. But what does that do? It creates really perverse incentives to gamble and go for luck, because the chances that I will ever have a huge amount of money like that through any actual like practical hard work are basically none, right? It's basically no chance.
Right.
So I can sit here and I can gamble, and the payoff is so high. I would talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I'm quitting my job as a plumber to go and become a day trader. And I'm like, oh, this is a terrible thing. Like, it might work out well for you, probably not, but it might work out well for you. That's not the thing that's so concerning to me. What's concerning to me is that for society, we're losing plumbers and electricians, people doing useful things, to go and do a net zero.
Yeah.
And not net zero in like carbon neutral sort of way. It's net zero in like a really, really perverse way. So I think that, you have this situation where as the world becomes more complex, people are less able to make good decisions. And because people are less able to make good decisions, the effect of luck seems to magnify in their decision making. And when you combine that with the fact that the payoff of luck goes up by orders of magnitude, the incentive is just to roll the dice. And that's not good at all. That's like a really, really bad thing that it's not clear to me that you can easily solve that sort of within the crypto sphere. I suspect that what will probably happen over time is one of the issues in crypto is it's too easy to create tokens. And so there will just become so many tokens and you'll get so much dilution across so many different projects that the pumps will be much less significant because it's diffused. And that will mean that people are generally not winning so much. The thing right now is we're in a bull market, basically. And so anything that you've bought in the last month is up pretty much, probably by quite a bit. And so, great, doesn't really matter. People are going to win. And if everybody's winning, it attracts more people who are wanting to come in and win. And when the market sort of equalizes at some stage, that will more or less go away. People won't have these big winning incentives. And then you'll kind of find out in a much more balanced place and probably get less of this sort of FOMO type behavior. That would be kind of my optimistic theory.
I like the analogy of the gaming behavior because it is more irrational, and it's basically like it starts with being irrational and just like you said, roll the dice, but then it can get addictive, right? So
and there's this fun social thing about it too, right? Like,
true.
It's like you and I are like buying Dogecoin together, and it's like you got these memes.
Yeah. And it's fun. Yeah. Let's support Elon, and I'm sure this is going to be great.
We're all going to make it.
We're all going to make it. This is great for society. It's great for crypto. And on one hand, I do agree with it, but on the other hand, where is this? What's the end game? And well, ultimately, and you've alluded to the regulatory aspect of it. You mentioned the regulatory circles. So this is one of the conversations is still lingering on how to treat crypto going forward. How do you see the end game play out in terms of the regulatory?
Well, I think that regulators will want to regulate and control. I think that's just pretty obvious. If you ask a surgeon what you should do, they're probably going to tell you should operate. Right, of course. That's going to be the case, and I think that. But to what extent? Well, I think they would like to basically make it exactly like stocks, et cetera, are, which is basically to say, okay, we're going to give you a brokerage account, and within that brokerage account, you're free to buy and sell however you would like. Yeah. And you're not allowed to go in and out of that brokerage account. And we're only going to have approved things that come into that brokerage account. And those brokers are regulated entities that we can call up the CEO and we can, find them and we can throw them in prison and we can do whatever else. To me, it's just like amply obvious that this is the direction that they would like to take it in. And try to package it in the package that they want to have so that they can control it, which is obvious. Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so that, to me, that's like the obvious trajectory that they would like to go in. Now, the thing that I find interesting about it is if you look at like the banking system, people don't really quite understand that banking functions as a network. And this is like very, very important. So, for example, I was talking to a bank CEO a few years ago, and there's an issue that if you're in the adult industry, you basically can't get banking. It's pretty much impossible. And so all the people in the adult industry, they lie, right? They're like, oh, I have a technology advertising company, or I have a janitorial company, or whatever. And that's like what they tell the bank, but they're really doing something else. And if you think this is like, it's kind of a bizarre concept because it's fully legal everybody watches porn. Everybody, does all this stuff. Like, what are we talking about? It's super normalized.
Right.
But somehow we stigmatize it at this bank level. And I was talking to the CEO, and I said, I don't understand. Like, there's these guys who are running this company. They've been around for years. They've got 60 employees, a perfectly legitimate company.
They watch porn.
Why can't they open?
Sorry.
There you go.
I had to.
Yeah.
More so probably than others, actually, you argue. But that's yeah. That's a whole nother part. That's a whole nother story.
That's a different podcast.
That's a different podcast, yeah. But okay, adult industry, it's...
Yeah, so I asked him, I was like, look, like, why won't you open an account for these guys?
Yeah.
And he's like, look, Michael, I totally agree with you, but here's the thing. If I accept them, then all the banks that I deal with are going to have a problem dealing with my bank. And that's going to create a ton of problems for my bank as a whole, and I can't afford that. This network effect. And that network effect has been, for a long time, principally pushed through the US and the EU. That was kind of the main monetary powers in the world, and they were able to kind of apply all this pressure really since post-Soviet Union, right? You kind of had this unipolar world. And now we're getting into this multipolar world. And in this multipolar world, a bunch of countries, you can see kind of you look at the support for Russia, war of Ukraine, like different stuff. I mean, basically, none of Latin America backed the U.S. And a bunch of the other places didn't back the U.S. And they're kind of saying, like, no, we don't really agree with your policies here. And the thing is, I think there's this kind of like very bizarre thing that can happen, which is like, to some extent, the most inclusive party, I think, wins. And the reason for this is, you imagine, like, okay, let's create a walled garden of Web3 in the US. Let's just pick that as a random place. Could be US and Europe, could be whatever, but let's say it's the US. Well, there's far fewer people in the US than there is outside of the US. And so all these people outside of the US are not participating in this walled garden, and they're creating, like, quote unquote dirty crypto, right? It's going through all sorts of transactions that, are not appropriate for the walled garden. The problem is, the guys inside the US, there's a lot of money to be made by doing business with the guys outside. You can't very well tell India, hey, listen, well, we're not going to do business with you because you're doing business with Russia. Like, we've already said that basically to China. We don't really want to do business with them. We're running out of places to go. So we need your resources. And so we have to start compromising. And that means you have to break down these walls. And the moment you start breaking down those walls, the whole thing falls apart. I mean, you can go and you can see that in Moscow today, the effect of sanctions is almost nothing. And why is that? Well, it's large part because of the fact that half the world didn't impose the sanctions. And so when half the world doesn't impose the sanctions, you might as well not have sanctions at all, because they'll just kind of intermediate through some other place. So I think they're going to have a very hard time. I was having a conversation with the head of VARA, the virtual asset regulator in regulatory authority in UAE the other day. And I was asking him, like, okay, so according to your rules, how does this work? When does somebody have to get regulated, et cetera? And he's like, okay, well, if it looks like an investment's an investment, you have to have a white paper. Okay, great. We're going to approve your white paper. It's a pretty easy regulatory process. Granted, it's a bit slow, but, not the end of the world. Then they're like, to distribute the token, now it's a different game. Now you need to have a broker-dealer license. Like, well, hang on a minute. Having a broker-dealer license is pretty serious. Like, this is, there's a bunch of money involved. There's a long process. There's a lot of oversight, et cetera. I'm like, so to give somebody my token, if they invested, I have to, be regulated. He's like, no, you can give it to them, but you can't sell it to the public. I'm like, well, this is ridiculous because, well, and on top of that, what I asked him, I'm like, okay, so I have to do it through an exchange. He's like, yeah, you have to do it through an exchange. I'm like, okay, but the person can just take their tokens off the exchange and create a liquidity pool on an AMM, and suddenly it's tradable by the whole public. So now, like, you just totally destroyed, like, you could tell them, hey, they're not allowed to take it off the exchange. He's like, no, you can't tell them that. No, they have to be able to take their stuff off the exchange. Well, the moment you do that, you enter this permissionless environment, and now anybody can deal with it. And so it's very unclear to me how they manage to regulate this if they still want to play ball with it. And I think that there's too many people who want to play ball with it and too much money that wants to play ball with it in order to end up going down that path. I mean, the EU has kind of some crazy rules coming out right now with respect to so much of this Web3 stuff, but it's like, well, how are you going to stop it?
Right.
Are you going to say, okay, we're going to try and block some decentralized network from all users in this part of the world because the person in Africa can launch their token and they can do whatever, and what are you going to do about it? You have no enforcement ability. So my theory is that the transition will be to try and set up this regulatory walled garden thing, which is basically what they would love, which is have a brokerage account so you can trade within the brokerage account. They don't actually care whether you make or lose money. They don't really care about that.
No, of course not.
What they care about is that they can control this environment of who's allowed and who's not allowed and who the players are, and they can find people and all that sort of thing.
Of course.
And so they will try to do that, but that ultimately it doesn't win. And the reason it doesn't win is just because they want to participate with people who have a different set of rules, and you can't, you'd have to have like almost unanimous compliance, and I just don't think that is likely to come about. But I might be wrong. Maybe they will kind of forced a global minimum tax, so maybe they will force some sort of global crypto regulation too. It's just not big enough yet, so I'm optimistic that they won't be able to.
You just mentioned that you had this conversation throughout your experience, and if you're talking to various actors within, I guess, the regulatory space, do you find that they know what they're talking about, or that they understand the space, in terms of how it works and what's out there in terms of Web3 and the DEXs and the centralized exchanges, how it all works? Do you feel that they're up to speed in terms of the education?
I think there's a spectrum. I think that in a few places they've put a lot of effort. Like, I think Singapore regulators, for example, work pretty hard to try and understand better than most. I think that most of them know enough to be dangerous, and then a bunch of them know nothing really at all. They just don't understand the concept of it. So yeah, I would hazard, like the guys here, for example, in UAE where I am. They're trying pretty hard, and I think they're like generally educated, and I think that they will kind of, the good news is that although the space has advanced much more quickly than people's understanding has, people are able to catch up with the broad concepts quicker than new broad concepts are coming up. And so I think that kind of will equalize, and you'll have in places like UAE and Singapore where they actually care to be on top of it, etc. The people who are running it will probably be pretty on the ball. My worry is that you can get people in certain areas, like let's just pick the EU as an example, who maybe there's like some key advisors and people who have invested in understanding it well, and they're able to articulate and realize what's going on. But then the people who actually vote on things and make things happen absolutely aren't. And I mean, you see this in the US, like Mark Zuckerberg gets dragged in before the Senate Oversight Committee, and they ask him how Facebook makes money. And you're like, really? I mean, you have a bunch of geriatric people running these major institutions and voting on it. Yeah. And now, death may solve that problem. That's there was a Steve Jobs line where he said, at first they were worried about computer literacy, and he realized, no, death will solve that problem. Everybody who isn't computer literate will eventually die off, and you'll be left with a computer literate population. And there's like a really interesting societal change which is about to happen, which is, if you look historically, you had kind of this turnover of people, whatever it was, every 20 years or something like that. And so each generation would kind of have the next generation of leaders. And what's happened this time is the baby boomers never retired, and Gen X kind of got skipped. And so you've got, like, in the US, the oldest person ever sitting as president is running for yet another term, and appears fairly senile. And
although I'm not sure he's actually, I don't know if he's going to actually continue.
We'll see.
Yeah. They just can't. It's just ridiculous.
One would think, but
I don't know what they're going to figure out. That, I don't know. There's going to be some story that he can't run, and I don't know. But come on. The whole world knows it.
I think, though, that
just the people who are actually there just are, in denial.
Yeah. I guess the question is, can he get elected? It could cost him the election. But I think that there's probably the real people who run things, because he clearly seems not capable of running things.
No, they're
really happy for this.
It's the administration. It's the people that are behind the scenes, which has always been the case.
Yeah. And so we'll see what happens. But the bottom line is, you've got these old people, right? I mean, you look at like somebody like Nancy Pelosi. She's old. Angela Merkel just retired. She's old. Trump is old. Bernie Sanders is old. Like, so many of these people are old, and nothing against old people. Like, you can get a lot of wisdom. I think there's a lot to be said for like learning from people older than you, and being inspired by the people younger than you, and all that sort of thing. But we have like this overwhelmingly dominated political system of old people. Now, the thing about that is mathematically, all of those people are going to retire in the next like 10 years. They just like, at some point, they can't, this is Joe Biden's last try. This is Trump's last try. This is, all these guys are going to go. And now you're going to skip a generation. You're not going to go from the baby boomers to Gen X. You're going to go from baby boomers to millennials.
You think so?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you've got the AOCs of the world and all this sort of thing who are going to come up. And those people have grown up with this stuff much more. But they also have the downside of not having gone through the experience of like the previous generation. So I thought this was like a very poignant moment when, I don't know if you recall, but Poland made this comment that basically Polish law was usurping EU law. And there's all these cries from places in Netherlands and Belgium and stuff saying, oh, kick them out, this is terrible, etc.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to take that position when you weren't there setting up the EU. And you had Angela Merkel saying, whoa, hang on, guys, slow down, let's deal with this more calmly. And it's because you have to understand that it's very, very difficult to get a large, disparate body of people to agree to things and come together. And that's a very fragile union. And you need to be very cautious about how you handle that. And so I guess my concern with the millennials is they'll be more cavalier because they don't understand. They just haven't gone through the experiences that were there 2 generations ago.
Right.
But at least what they will have is they will be much more tech friendly. And I suspect that will have a fairly significant role in what we see with regulation, kind of looking out 10 to 20 years.
You said something profound, that we're going from unipolar to multipolar. What is that? What do you think that means for Web3?
I mean, I think it's super bullish for Web3 because I think that Web3, at least in theory, provides some sort of neutral layer which allows the interface between these different parties. And, it's like, okay, what was the big issue with the sanctions on Russia? Well, they basically proved that the US dollar was not a trustworthy store of value anymore. So how does that make countries feel? Not great, right? Over time, you start to think, well, hang on a minute. What do I want? I want some sort of a neutral place that I can deal with parties on the other side. And this is the same, like, what's so great if, I want to lend assets and borrow against assets in Aave. I don't have to worry about vetting the other side. I don't have to worry about going and getting a lawyer. And I'm busy doing some lending right now, and I was dealing with a lawyer because we have to secure money via mortgages, and it's actually remarkably complex to go through that process. Then I discovered that the lawyer possibly has a conflict of interest, and I have to fire him and go and get some other lawyer and all that. Like, you don't want that. You want to just have like a simple place that allows 2 parties to interface with each other that is credibly neutral. And Web3 offers that. And so I suspect that the connective tissue between these varying different parties, each with their own values and their different agendas, etc., is going to become increasingly valued, have a massive value accrual. And we haven't really seen the tipping point of that yet, but it strikes me that will be very, very important if we kind of continue in the direction of this multipolarity.
Does multipolarity for you also mean like deglobalization? Or does that, or are you not are you not thinking about it in those terms?
I don't think that it means I guess it depends what you mean by globalization. So if you think of globalization in the sense that there is trade and interaction between parties around the world, I don't think that's going to decrease.
No.
I mean, even if you think about the fact that the US has been kind of deglobalizing, onshoring things, etc., most of the rest of the world is not. And they can't, because of the complexity of supply chains, because of increasing interest in having global talent from different parts of the world as you have increased specialization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think that's not going to stop. What I suspect it definitely does mean is that you won't rely on a unified vision, the kind of like single idea of like, this is how we're doing things and we're moving in lockstep and here is the agenda and we're moving forward. I think that will break down.
Isn't that kind of what's been going on though?
Of course, absolutely.
I mean, we can totally get into this rabbit hole, having the the WEFs, I think you know where I'm aiming at, but having a universal government, CBDCs, let's control everybody, et cetera, et cetera. You think that's going to fall?
Well, I think there's a couple separate things in there. So I don't think that you're going to get a unified government. I think that is pretty unlikely to succeed. I just think that there's too many parties with too much interest not to have that happen in order for it to happen. It's, I think, a really, really tough coordination problem, and you don't really have solid enforcement mechanisms. I think we're kind of like in the late stage of basically what's happening is you're seeing this deviance from the desired path, and the attempt to address that deviance is to try and clamp down. And so you see that through political pressure, largely through the US and the EU. It's not really meaningful forces outside of those two, I don't think, that are pushing this. And so they try and push it on other countries. But if you look at the relative GDP of the EU, it's declining really rapidly.
Yeah.
And so as EU influence declines, then where's the ally left for the US? Like the US, okay, is still massive and will probably still be massive for quite a long time. But relatively at some point in time, the collective value in these other places is significantly large that they can say, yeah, do you know what, we're just going to ignore the US. And then what? Like, are you going to go to war over it? I think you're increasingly getting people who are concerned about the US meddling in foreign politics. I mean, it's just this train wreck of failures since the Korean War, basically.
Yes.
And I think that there's a large portion of the local population who feels that this is messed up and doesn't want to deal with it. And so, some of them want isolationism and some of them want whatever else. But I don't think that the political will be there for long enough. And I think that there's too many other parties with their own interests. So I think you'll continue to have a massive increase in the amount of global interaction and trade. I'm like hugely bullish on the idea that we will see workforces globally diversifying, just because it just makes economic sense. If people can work from anywhere, then why do you hire locally? You might as well hire where it's cheaper.
Right.
And this means that you're inherently connecting to countries all over the place. And I just don't see that ending anytime soon. People will be more mobile as a result of that. And so, yeah, I think that's almost an inevitable trend. And then faced with, on the other side, I don't think that they can unify these governments. I think they'll fail. But I think individual countries will try very hard to have CBDCs. It just makes sense for people who want to have a bunch of control. And the good news is there will be competing CBDCs. So when you kind of factor that in, if I can choose to use one versus another, again, how do you stop that, right? If I want to pay you with US dollar CBDC and you're on the Chinese yuan CBDC, what, do you just refuse my US dollar CBDCs? Well, so long as you can take it and accept it and spend it somewhere else, then, how do you enforce that? I think it's the most inclusive party ultimately wins in that regard. Yeah,
fair enough. I'd love to actually talk more about this. It's just, I think it's fascinating and super relevant, but I do have to ask you about De.Fi.
yeah, no problem.
So just back to, we did start talking about it. So De.Fi, per your website, states you're a Web3 super app and crypto antivirus. It would be great to unpack that twofold description. So what does it mean and what does it do?
Sure.
And so, sorry, if I may, sorry to interrupt, but when I was listening to some of your previous talks, you talked about DeFi yield, not so much De.Fi. Has the branding, the wording changed? Or has there been like an evolution into what De.Fi has been doing in the last 4 years?
Correct. Yeah. So basically, when we started, we were into yield farming. So we started the first ever yield farming Telegram group, and we're kind of aggregating people who are interested in that subject and sharing ideas and what was going on, et cetera. And so that was kind of where we got our start. And, when things are moving fast, you kind of have to pick a name and you're like, okay, great, it's DeFi yield. And as time went on, we found that the market didn't really, what they thought of us as and what the name implied were two very different things. So hence we were like, okay, we need to rebrand. And we kind of looked around and we managed to acquire this really fabulous domain, which is de.fi, so De.Fi, and super happy about that. So we rebranded, and so it's the same organization, it's the same team, it's the same everything, but we found De.Fi or de.fi more suitable to kind of our vision and what we're doing, etc. So that's the difference in the change of name over time and the kind of inconsistencies in branding. So yeah, that's that. Now, in terms of the product and unpacking this Web3 super app and crypto antivirus, I think it's worth just sort of stepping back and thinking of like, what is the vision and what is the mission and what is the way in which we feel we can contribute and differentiate in that space. So in terms of like kind of a vision, you're like, okay, well, we want to see lots and lots of people in Web3 and in De.Fi. You know, what does it take to onboard 1 billion users? And we're quite a long ways from 1 billion users at this point in time. And when I look at it, I think that two of the principal problems you have, there are a variety of them, but two of the principal ones are ease of use. It's really quite a terrible user experience. If you just kind of think like, if I tell my friends, hey, you should go and get into De.Fi. They're like, great, well, what do I do?
Yes.
You're like, well, first of all, you have to go and download this thing called MetaMask, which you're going to install on there. Okay, great, I did that. Now what? Well, now you have to buy some ETH. Okay, well, how do I do that? Okay, now I've got this ETH. Now what do I do? Well, you have to go and swap it for something. Well, how do I know what to swap it for? Where do I go to look? How do I, and like everything is in all these weird different places.
Yeah, it's very fragmented, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, there's so many steps to do simple things. You know, you want to change to a chain. Well, now you're going to bridge something over there, and then you have to have a different coin to pay for gas in that chain versus the other chain. And what a mess, what a mess. So we want to create a much better, easier user experience. That's kind of like the first objective. And so the idea of being a super app is to try and aggregate as much of that together as possible. And so we led with being the first ones to have EVM chains and non-EVM chains all bundled together. We led with being the first ones to do custodial and non-custodial, so you can see exchange balances on your account along with your non-custodial balances. And you know, we support whatever is 43 chains or something, enormous number of protocols. So I kind of just sort of think like, what do you want to do? Well, I want to figure out what are the opportunities that I have. So we have kind of this explore opportunities thing where you can find what are the opportunities out there. And this brings us into the second thing, which is then I want it to be safe, right? How are you going to get 1 billion users on there if people are losing their money all the time and their wallet gets drained and somebody just hacked them or they bought some token that they can't sell because it was a malicious contract, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like this is way problematic for getting mass adoption. And so hence we have this antivirus functionality that we kind of layer on top of there. And that is, first of all, our scanner. So we have the ability to essentially automate the process of doing an audit on a smart contract. So I was mentioning before, like, okay, it's supposed to be transparent and open, but people can't read Solidity. What are you talking about?
Right.
So our scanner, though, will tell you all about that smart contract that you're wanting to engage in human readable form, in a way that tells you this is risky or this is not risky. And so that's, I think, really useful. And then we have our Shield product, which essentially will scan your wallet proactively and tell you, hey, you've approved these malicious contracts. You probably shouldn't do that. You should probably revoke access to them. We won't do it for you. We're not going to tell you what to do. But you know, it's a recommendation that you probably should do this. And we've created APIs so that a lot of other wallets can integrate. We're integrated with CoinGecko. We're integrated with Eviscan and whatever many wallets, etc., to try and kind of proliferate this safety network across the world of De.Fi. And so, yeah, that's kind of like the interaction of the two main areas that we're working on. And I think that realistically, you know, when we have internal conversations, you know, there's a lot of things that technologically we're not going to be able to innovate on, right? Meaning that, you know, there's some things that are just like really hard engineering problems. And good on those people who are doing this. You know, there's people who are doing really complex math around ZK proofs or around various different types of privacy and MPC and stuff like that, fully homomorphic encryption, etc. This is great stuff. I love it. Our team is not going to be able to do that. Like, we don't have deep enough technical expertise in some of those niches to be able to do it. But what we can do, what we can be very good at, is innovating the user experience. And simplifying that. And so I think this is really what it comes down to. Everything that we're doing is to try and take all this stuff that if you were really technical, in theory, you could do that. But let's try and make it really easy for average people who have no technical ability to, frankly, have better insight than people who are very technical through the use of technology. And I think about this too with respect to, regulation. We were talking about earlier about regulation, what do you want to do, et cetera. So I kind of view that there's clearly times where regulation is important. I think that somebody who's purely an anarchist who wants no regulation is probably a bit naive. It's just, that's the reality. But I think regulation should be a last resort. And I think this is where I would principally fault politicians, is that for them it's the first resort. And I think that in general we should aspire to looking for solutions in technology before we look for regulatory solutions. And I think that a lot of these problems can be solved through technological solutions. And so we endeavor to bring those technological solutions to users and hopefully make it, like I said, accessible, easy, much more safe. Obviously, nothing will be 100% safe ever, but much more safe, and do that all in a single user experience.
Perfect. Yeah, at this point, that's very key in terms of the onboarding people. Do you track or monitor, you have the scan, or the scanner, the shield. Do you track or monitor, this is very layman speak, but the success rate from the scans or the hacks or bad actor attacks or from whatever you're scanning with these programs? Do you have any sort of KPIs that you keep?
Yeah, we have a variety of different stuff that we look at. So first of all, we'll kind of take a look at just what is the landscape out there. And I don't know what the latest stats are, but there was one point in time something 90% of all smart contracts on BNB chain were honeypots or scams or something. It is an outrageously...
No, 90%. Oh my God.
It was some outrageous number. Now, fortunately, the average person, attention tends to cluster on, the larger projects. And so you don't necessarily have to get exposed to it. But yeah, just an enormous number that were out there. So we have some stats around the percentage of honeypots, the percentage of this, that, the other thing. Yeah, so very high numbers of bad tokens. And that probably doesn't count, if you throw in NFTs, each NFT being a separate contract and stuff, okay, then, it favors much more the kind of safety side of it, which is good. But it was a really high percentage of contracts that were in some way problematic. Then what we look a lot at is we track probably more closely than anyone all the different hacks and scams that are taking place. We built this thing called the Rect database, and we publish it around, and it's been used in various different academic research, et cetera. And so our developers will actually go in and they will look at what are the vulnerabilities in the code, what actually happened, et cetera, to result in this problem. And so we'll have kind of statistics around which percentage of those would have been prevented through our software, so people are kind of protected on that basis. And the goal is for that number to be very high. We're well in excess of 80%. I don't know what the exact figure is today. And some of them, unfortunately, are there's just not that much you can do as a user because it's more on the protocol level. If you're talking about a flash loan attack or something, okay, it's a tough thing for us to. It's not really a user problem. It's something that's vulnerability there. So, or if there's a front end problem, that's a whole other issue that's kind of separate from, we're just doing smart contracts out of it, right? But we can address a lot of them, and that's great. And then we'd have some stats around, of course, the number of revoked contracts, et cetera, that people have through us. I don't know what the number of that is currently. I mean, we've had over 2 million wallets connected to and tracked through our scanner. So that's, it's a lot of people who have...
That's substantial.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that I think is really, really great. And so, yeah, it gives a little bit of stats. We tried to then parse that out and figure out, the amount of money that was potentially saved from that. Those numbers are probably, if I'm being really realistic about it, pretty rough, right? It's a hard thing to figure out, but at least gives some sort of a metric of success.
So you also have a De.Fi token, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, we do.
What's the utility of the De.Fi token within your platform?
So there's a variety of different things that factor in there. So at this stage, a big part of our vision, of course, is decentralization, right? And so we have to run a bunch of fairly sophisticated infrastructure to do what we do. We run various different indexers and full nodes and various different, like I said, there's these APIs. We have like over 50 million API calls per month to our scanner, et cetera. And so the objective is to decentralize that infrastructure. And so then in order to do that, the two things are true. One is you'll be able to stake that token to address the common Sybil issues that exist in any decentralized system, and then simultaneously to be able to pay transaction fees on that particular network. So that's one of the things that is important. Mm-hmm. Then we have premium features that are part of our platform. Mm-hmm. And so for people who want to participate in the premium features, you need to have access to the token, et cetera. And then we're helping right now. One of the things we've been pretty successful at is being able to market and raise capital for, et cetera, our own project. And so we're in the process of launching an ecosystem accelerator. And so the ecosystem accelerator is designed to take projects that are much earlier and kind of give them the learnings that we've had, help them with the process of raising capital and marketing, et cetera. And so for people to participate in those, mm-hmm. They'll stake the token, and there's some kind of gamification things there to help engage users onto these other projects that are ongoing. So those are kind of the main things at this stage, but it's sort of an ongoing mission to find all the different ways to best leverage the use of a token.
Very cool. I heard you speak about partnering with CoinGecko. Mm-hmm. So in retrospect, obviously Web3 security should be an ongoing community effort, but mm-hmm. Not just plugging in tools, but can you speak about your partner ecosystem? And
well, as I said, so we have APIs.
Yes.
And so those APIs allow any third party to be able to plug in and utilize our scanner security technology. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that, exchanges, typically talking about like DEXs or aggregators or whatever, mm-hmm. can essentially have it run a scan prior to doing a swap to be able to inform you, having a wallet be able to integrate this and run a scan. Mm-hmm. If you go to Gecko Terminal, you'll see like a security score related to each thing that comes from our platform. Mm. And so, the idea is that it's open, permissionless. Anyone can take those APIs and they can go and they can integrate them into their platform and make use of the technology, mm-hmm. and hopefully bring some added degree of safety and security to their users.
So in terms of De.Fi being a Web3 super app, I listened to your talk from ETH Milan.
Oh, great.
Which was last year. Yeah. No, I did my research.
That's awesome.
I mean, you have quite a lot of content out there, but what caught my interest was, you talking about the silos and how the whole process of onboarding in DeFi is very fragmented. Yep. But then you are also connected to TradFi. So you used interactive brokers and as an example. Mm-hmm. Is that like a thing? Like, are you actually connected with them at this point?
No. As a project, we're not connected with interactive brokers.
I see. Okay. Well, very cool. I'm trying to think, trying to pick your brain on everything De.Fi. I think you've covered quite some ground. What would you say are the main challenges that you face
as a project?
With what we were just talking about, like De.Fi, for example, or what have been like the major hurdles that you've experienced? Apart from the rug pull experience that probably traumatized the entire team.
Yeah, not so enjoyable.
No, I'm sure not.
So, I mean, anytime you try to build something, it is a lot harder than it sounds. Mm-hmm. So just in general, I have a tremendous respect for anyone who builds anything. Mm-hmm. I often see people say do this. It's like, well, that's really good. Any idea how many developer hours that takes? Any idea how much planning goes into that? Mm-hmm. And really simple things that might seem, it's like, oh, you should add a button on your site that does this. Well, guess what? There's only so much screen real estate, mm-hmm. and you have to pick and choose and prioritize and have a nice user experience. And so we've got a really excellent product manager who is thinking about this all the time. Mm-hmm. But just making those things, making a product that works well is a really complex, challenging thing. Now, aside from that, I think that to me, one of the biggest challenges is educating and trying to get people to integrate these tools that really should always be integrated into part of their flow. Because if you use them as part of their flow, your experience will be safer and better. and it should just be a natural thing that you go and do. However, a lot of people will not, and that's, I think, pretty logical. You sort of have this tendency for least effort. You don't want to consume extra work, and so hence why we kind of go from, okay, we'll go from needing you to look at audits to using a scanner, from using a scanner to having a shield. It's like you're sort of progressively trying to get into the user flow. Mm-hmm. But that's a really big challenge, and it's really, the Web3 space is pretty ADD. That's
a good one. That's so true.
A lot of jumping from one thing to another. There's massive competition for attention.
Yes.
And so, just fighting irrelevance in the mind of users is a significant challenge all the time. And so I would say that those collectively are probably some of the biggest challenges. There's lots of little individual things in there. I have a whole bunch of pet peeves around sort of market perception of stuff. Like, we had this thing where when we were raising capital, we didn't put our team's bios up and things on LinkedIn, and the reason was, in Web3 during the bull market, everybody's going to headhunt all your people. So the moment you say, like, oh, I'm the lead developer at so-and-so, they're getting a call offering them double the money to go off to some other place. It's actually dangerous for your project to go and do that. But then the perception of people is, oh, you must have an outsourced team. Because you're not showing your team, you don't have, we've got like 60 or 50 people, and like 30 of them are engineers and all this sort of thing, but nobody believes you because you can't put this up there. And so there's like this huge issue. One of the things I try to be very cognizant of these days, because we didn't have our token released until fairly recently, but I think there's what I call the twin masters problem in Web3. And this really affects a lot of projects, which is, if you think about the incentives for a project should ideally be driven towards their customer, right? Like, okay, if we optimize for the customer, that should have all this payoff down the road. But it's not exactly clear in Web3 who your customer is, because one of your customers is the people who are actually using your protocol. The other customer is the people who are buying your token. And these two may have very different desires about what they want. And I love DAOs. I think DAOs are a wonderful thing. I think it's really cool as a space for experimentation. And I'm highly disappointed by almost every DAO out there. I think they're mostly just completely poorly thought out trash. And I become pretty bearish on community governance just watching community behavior. We would have a situation when we're, lining up exchanges to launch, and we feel like a lot of pressure to launch by a certain date because we promised the community, etc. And if you were to go to the community and ask them, hey guys, should we launch on this date? They'd be like, oh, of course you should, because we want this. But the truth is, right, as an insider who's dealing with it every day and negotiating with all different parties, that if you wait a week, you can get a much better outcome for them. But, are they going to think and vote that way? Not necessarily. So, kind of wrestling with trying to please community while trying to make a great product, while trying to, deliver a lot of value and be practical and work within the constraints of the team, etc., is a really, really tough thing to do.
It's hard.
Very hard.
I mean, it sounds hard. And you have a lot of pressure. And it's funny enough, I actually wanted to ask about the team. As I was going around and clicking on the website, I was like, they don't, you don't have who's working on this, and then try to do the research and look on LinkedIn and see who's part of it. Yep. Obviously, there must be a reason. So fair enough. You just explained it.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a bunch of really, really awesome people who I'm super proud of, and they're really excellent. And of course, a bunch of them we've put out there more over time. Mm-hmm. And in a bear market, it's not as big a deal as it was in 2021 or something. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's just these factors that people make judgments based on. Mm-hmm. That it's kind of pet peeves for me, because I'm like, no, the opposite is true. But how can you see this? And do you even bother trying to explain it to them? And then they run around and say all sorts of stuff. And then people get ideas, and I don't know. It's so you're like, okay, how do you just keep focused, keep building, try and do what's best for the project and for the community over time, and hopefully that has a big payoff.
So what's on your short-term roadmap plate? I guess, short-term meaning for the rest of the year?
I mean,
and then long-term.
Yeah, so the two really big things that we're working on right now is this ecosystem accelerator. We're going to be launching a lot of stuff with that over the next little while, and I think that's opportunity to kind of, again, like, I want to try and connect all these different disparate parts of Web3, right? And you want to try and support projects that are going to be involved in there, and you want to kind of bring them together and make that successful. And so that's like a huge thing that we've got going on that will be present over the next few months, especially as launching a lot. And then the other thing is this decentralization of infrastructure. So we've been engaging in a lot of technical conversations about, okay, like, how do we build out this decentralized network? And, what functionality does it have? And, how do we kind of create something that's differentiated and provides value? And what are the key problems that we're trying to solve? And how do we go about solving those problems? And which ones are reasonable technical challenges to jump on, and which ones are not? Of course, there's like this big thing about De.Fi on Bitcoin now. This is sort of this, you have this kind of evolution of BitVM and stacks and various different protocols have been really successful. And so, the ETF got approved, and so there's just like enormous liquidity there. And so how do you harmonize that with the rest of the sort of EVM, et cetera, world? These are kind of things that we're thinking a lot about, and how we can play a role in helping to bring that from the forefront. Yeah,
the ETF phenomenon is a whole different animal.
It is,
I feel like now, just, again, psychologically with the influx of greed and everybody participating and getting in. I think that's open to, not to basically repeat what everyone has already said, but it's opening up a massive door. And I don't think people understand the capacity that, the headwind that brings to the table.
Yeah.
It should be an interesting year in terms of the market. But on the flip side, regardless of what happens, obviously we keep on building and keep focus.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, Michael, we've talked a great deal, and I'm trying to think. I have always have so many questions and jot down ideas. And looking back, I hope that I've done justice to the work that you do in terms of asking the right questions.
Oh, thank you.
Is there anything that I might have missed, or that you would like to add that I have not asked?
I'm sure we could talk for a very long time. This is a super interesting space, right?
It is.
One of the things that I really love about this space is, you were mentioning about there's scamminess and there's scammers and things like that. There's a lot of that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what you have, which I love, I really, really enjoy this about the space, is you have a whole bunch of smart, diverse, passionate people.
Yeah.
And you can talk to people from all kinds of backgrounds who are really, really excellent, who are thinking deeply, who are interested in bringing things to the space. Mm-hmm. And they're coming together in this combination that is really unprecedented. One person is like a former nuclear physicist, and somebody else is a molecular chef, and somebody else is, somebody who's specialized in developing devices for testing some subtle thing about blood insulin, and they're all like working together in this space to build something new and interesting. So I really, 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 really like that. Mm-hmm. I like connecting with those kind of people and having interesting conversations. So yeah, we could talk for days about all the different things that are progressing in the space. I guess what I would tend to leave people with is the message. Of course, we're still very early.
Yeah.
And it might be hard to appreciate that until you start getting in and trying to use some of this stuff, and then you realize this is really hard to use. And you're like, Microsoft DOS was really hard to use as well. It's an issue. So ironically, a bunch of them maybe never use Microsoft DOS, so they don't really get the analog. But we're still very early, and that means that the vision of what it will be in 20 years is probably vastly different than what you experience today. Mm-hmm. And in that gap is just this tremendous potential that we will hopefully fill up. And so I really encourage people to go out and try it, for one, test different things, but also get involved in some of these communities. If you can help to build projects, that's excellent. If you can help to support projects, that's excellent, because it will take a lot of work and a lot of brain power, etc. And I hope that what people will do is not just kind of do what I call Me Too projects, where they just copy what else everybody else is doing, even if it might be really tempting from a dollars standpoint, but instead sort of think of what are different ways of doing things. And this is just an incredible laboratory for experimentation if you want to bring something to life. And that opportunity won't be here forever, so take advantage of it while it's here.
Awesome. Michael, thanks so much for this insightful and lively talk. I think this is probably the first podcast that we mentioned the adult industry. No, but that's not the key takeaway. Loved it. I mean, it's always a pleasure to hear and interesting, like you said, there's, different people from different facets in life and backgrounds. It's just always a pleasure to hear different perspectives on the reality of Web3 and De.Fi and what it all means in terms of, we call it the democratization of finance, what is and what is yet to come. So I truly enjoyed having this conversation with you. And yeah, like you said, we could talk for forever. I mean, we haven't even gone to the Balkan to the Balkan part.
No.
But let me just, if I could circle this up and just ask what's the best way to, I mean, I obviously know this and we'll include all this in the show notes, but the best way to follow your work and contact or perhaps participate within what you're doing with De.Fi and your other ventures.
So for De.Fi, we are on Twitter, x.com/De.Fi. So, that's a pretty easy thing to go and check out, and de.fi for the website. Yeah, it was very, very cool that my business partner was able to arrange getting that for us. So that was awesome. Personally, you can go and look me up, Michael Rosmer, on Twitter. It's probably the easiest. I have a YouTube channel, Offshore Citizen, and, hopefully we'll continue to put out good content. So would love to hear from people.
Awesome. Thanks so much again. And I wish you all the best and hope you keep in touch. Hopefully we can have a part 2 of this conversation at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much.
Thanks again to our guests, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks also to the Bariam Music team for providing their music. You can check them out on bariammusic.com. The episode supporting information is on our website, blockchainrecorded.com. Our podcast is available on Google, Apple, and Amazon Podcasts, as well as on YouTube, Spotify, and Radio Public. You can follow us on Twitter at Recorded Podcast and YouTube, where we are super grateful for your support. Stay tuned for our next episode.